Talking about craniopharyngioma, and as the name implies, it is both cranio, your head, and pharynx, pharyngioma. And the reason it's a combination of cranio and pharynx is because its embryologic origin is from ectoderm. The diencephalon is going to be projecting down. That's the neuroectoderm piece of the pituitary. And from the bottom is the surface ectoderm. So there's a stalactite of neuroectoderm heading south and a stalagmite of surface ectoderm heading north. This pouch created by the surface ectoderm is the Rathke's pouch. And when the two things meet, that cleft is called the Rathke's cleft. And it's a potential space for which cystic fluid can accumulate in this space and make a suprasellar mass. So, the anterior and the posterior portions of the pituitary gland have different embryologic origins. One is from the neuroectoderm from the diencephalon, and one is from the surface ectoderm from the pharynx, leading to the tumor we call craniopharyngioma. And what this means is you can have both cystic and solid components to craniopharyngioma, and because it's a benign lesion and it's chronic, it can be associated with calcification. And so for suprasellar mass lesions with heterogeneous content, we might use both a CT and an MRI to help us give us complementary information about the nature of this cystic lesion. Because a cystic pituitary adenoma can look very similar to a cystic craniopharyngioma, and with the presence of that calcification would push us towards craniopharyngioma. Now, once the suprasellar mass forms, it can occur in children or in adults. It's kind of got two peaks of incidence, even though this is an embryologically origin tumor. And there's many theories about why older people would get an embryologic thing that you were born with. And one of them is metaplasia, a change in the histology of the tumor that allows it to become a mass. So in patients who have a suprasellar lesion, this represents the chiasm, the sella, and the stalk. So the pituitary gland lives inside this saddle, which we call the Turkish saddle, the sella turcica, the stalk, and then the chiasm. And so a lesion from the pituitary is usually an intracellular mass with suprasellar extension. And so on the coronal imaging, it looks like a snowman because we have the intracellular mass growing. It's pinched in by the diaphragma cella. And then once it's free of that diaphragma, the head of the snowman will develop. And then the poor chiasm will be worn as a hat. And so once the snowman hits the chiasm, he's going to bend those nasal crossing fibers and cause the typical field defect, the bitemporal hemianopsia. And because we're pressing from below when we're arising from the pituitary gland, usually the bitemporal hemianopsia in the pituitary adenoma is denser superiorly. So a denser superiorly bitemporal hemianopsia is normally a sign that we have a suprasellar mass from an intracellular mass with suprasellar extension, and mostly that's pituitary adenoma. However, if we're derived from the Rathke's cleft or the craniopharyngioma, the tumor is often suprasellar in origin with no intracellular component, and that means we might be pressing from above. And when you're pressing from above, that produces the bitemporal hemianopsia that is often denser inferiorly. And that's super important information to communicate to our neurosurgical colleagues, because if it's a pituitary adenoma, we're way more likely to be able to access and approach that lesion from a transsphenoidal approach. If it's completely upstairs, it's way harder to get to the lesion from below. And so this person might need a craniotomy. So we'd love to be able to tell our neurosurgeons that they have a bitemporal hemianopsia that's denser inferiorly. Because we have a cystic component and a solid component, we might recommend a CT scan to look for calcification, and that might change the surgical approach. All derived from that visual field. So craniopharyngioma is one of our most common suprasellar tumors that we see. Pituitary adenomas are number one, but craniopharyngioma and meningioma are probably number 2 and number 3 in my clinic. You need to do a visual field on all of these patients, and what we're looking for is a bitemporal hemianopsia denser inferiorly.